Los Angeles sleeps uneasily under a blanket of darkness. The city has been blacked out, every window covered, every street light extinguished. But the darkness won't last long. In just moments, the night sky over Southern California will erupt in a display of fire and fury that will leave witnesses convinced they're watching the invasion of America. Air raid sirens begin their mournful wail at 25 minutes past 2 in the morning. Within minutes, thousands of air raid wardens scramble to their posts. Searchlights snap on, their powerful beams slicing through the darkness, sweeping back and forth across the heavens like the fingers of some desperate god searching for an enemy. Residents jolt awake, hearts pounding, fumbling in the dark as the reality of what's happening crashes over them. This is it. This is what they've been dreading since December. The Japanese are here. At 16 minutes past 3 in the morning, the guns open up. The 37th Coast Artillery Brigade begins firing 50 caliber machine guns and anti-aircraft shells into the night sky. The sound is tremendous, apocalyptic. Orange tracer rounds arc upward into the darkness. Shells burst in brilliant flashes thousands of feet above the city. The ground trembles, windows rattle in their frames. The air itself seems to vibrate with each thunderous report. For nearly an hour, over 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition tear into the sky above Los Angeles. Residents pour into their yards and streets, some in bathrobes and pajamas, staring upward at what looks like the end of the world. Some claim they see aircraft. Others describe formations of planes, dozens of them, caught in the crisscrossing searchlight beams. Still others report seeing something stranger, something that doesn't move like any airplane they've ever seen. When dawn breaks and the guns finally fall silent, Los Angeles will discover something shocking. Despite the massive barrage, despite over 1,400 shells fired into the sky, not a single enemy aircraft has been shot down. Not a single bomb has fallen on the city. The only damage comes from American shells that failed to explode properly, crashing back to Earth to destroy property and shatter lives. 5 civilians are dead. 3 killed in traffic accidents during the chaos. 2 felled by heart attacks brought on by sheer terror. So what happened that night? What did thousands of Los Angeles residents and military personnel see in the sky? Was it a Japanese attack? A false alarm triggered by jittery nerves? Weather balloons caught in searchlight beams? Or something else entirely, something that decades later would fuel one of the most enduring UFO mysteries in American history? This is the story of the Battle of Los Angeles. It's a story of fear and confusion, of a nation on the razor's edge of panic, of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. It's a story that begins not on that chaotic night in February, but 2.5 months earlier, on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, December 7th, 1941, the date that would live in infamy. At 7:55 in the morning, hundreds of Japanese fighter planes descended on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The attack was devastating, meticulously planned, and utterly shocking to most Americans. In just over 2 hours, the Japanese destroyed or damaged nearly 20 American naval vessels, including 8 battleships. More than 300 airplanes were destroyed or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans died, with another 1,100 wounded. In a single morning, the United States lost more lives than in any previous attack on American soil. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor cannot be overstated. For generations, Americans had lived with a sense of invulnerability, protected by vast oceans on either side of the continent. Yes, the nation had fought wars, but those wars were fought elsewhere, on foreign soil, far from American shores. The idea that a foreign power could strike deep into American territory, could rain destruction down on American servicemen in what was considered a secure harbor, shattered that illusion of safety in the most brutal way possible. The attack transformed the American psyche overnight. On December 6th, the United States was a nation still clinging to isolationist sentiments, still debating whether to enter the war raging across Europe and Asia. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared war on Japan. The vote was nearly unanimous. The American people, previously divided on the question of intervention, were now united in their determination to fight. A poll taken just days after the attack showed that 97% of Americans supported the declaration of war. But unity of purpose did not mean freedom from fear. In fact, Pearl Harbor sparked a wave of anxiety that swept across the nation, particularly along the West Coast. If the Japanese could strike Hawaii, what would stop them from attacking San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle? The Pacific coastline of the United States suddenly seemed terrifyingly vulnerable. This fear was not entirely without foundation. In the days and weeks following Pearl Harbor, Japanese submarines did indeed prowl the waters off the American West Coast. These weren't just reconnaissance missions. These submarines actively hunted American merchant vessels, and they found plenty of targets. Between the last half of December 1941 and February 1942, Japanese submarines attacked numerous ships in waters off California, Oregon, and Washington. The list of vessels attacked reads like a catalogue of maritime disaster. The SS Emedio was torpedoed off Cape Mendocino, California, on December 20th, 1941. 5 crew members died, and 80,000 barrels of crude oil spilled into the Pacific. The SS Cynthia Olson was sunk. The SS Larry Doheny went down. The SS Camden met the same fate. The SS Montebello was torpedoed and sunk. Ship after ship fell victim to Japanese submarines operating with apparent impunity in American waters. For people living along the coast, these attacks were more than just news reports. They were stark reminders that the enemy was close, that the war was real, that nowhere was truly safe. Fishing boats putting out to sea knew they might encounter a Japanese submarine. Merchant vessels hugged the coastline, trying to stay in shallow water where submarines couldn't easily follow. The ocean, which had once seemed like a protective moat, now felt like a highway for the enemy. The government response to this mounting anxiety was, in hindsight, perhaps not as reassuring as it was intended to be. Secretary of War Henry Stimson warned Americans that cities should be prepared to accept occasional blows from enemy forces. Occasional blows. The phrase hung in the air like a dark promise. What did that mean exactly? Bombing raids? Shelling from offshore? Full-scale invasion? Nobody knew. And in the absence of clear information, imagination filled the void. Cities up and down the West Coast began preparing for war on the home front. Anti-aircraft gun batteries were installed at strategic locations. Bunkers were built. Barrage balloons were raised above important facilities, their cables intended to snag any attacking aircraft foolish enough to fly low. Air raid drills became a regular part of life. Blackout curtains went up in windows across California, Oregon, and Washington. Air raid wardens were appointed and trained, given helmets and armbands and the authority to enforce blackout regulations. Los Angeles, as a major center for military manufacturing and a crucial port city, took these preparations especially seriously. The city hosted several anti-aircraft batteries, accompanied by powerful searchlights that could illuminate aircraft at high altitude. The 37th Coast Artillery Brigade manned these positions, their crews trained to identify aircraft by silhouette and to engage enemy bombers before they could reach their targets. But training was one thing, combat was another. And most of these young men had never seen combat. They'd never fired their weapons at a real enemy. They'd never experienced the confusion and chaos of an actual attack. They were, in the parlance of the time, green, inexperienced. And that inexperience, combined with understandable anxiety, created a volatile situation. The fear wasn't limited to military personnel. Ordinary civilians felt it too. Every unidentified boat spotted offshore sparked rumors of Japanese destroyers. Every unusual sound in the night could be the prelude to an attack. On December the 9th, 1941, just 2 days after Pearl Harbor, unsubstantiated reports of approaching aircraft caused a minor invasion panic in New York City. Stock prices tumbled, people fled into the streets. It was a false alarm, but it demonstrated just how on edge the entire nation had become. Out on the West Coast, the paranoia ran even deeper. Pilots and radar operators, most of them lacking significant experience, sometimes mistook fishing boats for submarines. Logs floating in the ocean became periscopes in overactive imaginations. There were even reports of whales being mistaken for Japanese vessels. In one particularly embarrassing incident, American forces fired on what turned out to be a pod of whales, absolutely convinced they were engaging enemy submarines. This was the atmosphere in early 1942. Fear, uncertainty, vigilance bordering on paranoia. Every American knew the Japanese had already proven capable of a devastating surprise attack. Every American wondered when and where they might strike next. And in Southern California, that question was about to be answered in the most dramatic way possible, even if the answer itself would remain frustratingly unclear. The United States government also began viewing its own Japanese American citizens with deep suspicion. The combination of racial prejudice that had existed long before the war, coupled with the fear and anger generated by Pearl Harbor, created a toxic mixture. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which would ultimately lead to the forced removal and internment of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were American citizens. This order was signed just 6 days before the Battle of Los Angeles. 6 days. The timing would prove significant. By late February 1942 then, Los Angeles was a city wound tight as a spring. Military installations were on high alert. Anti-aircraft crews manned their guns around the clock. Civilians slept fitfully, if they slept at all, half expecting to be jolted awake by air raid sirens at any moment. The city was ready for anything, or thought it was. What actually happened would exceed even their most anxious imaginings. If Los Angeles was a powder keg waiting to explode in late February 1942, then the match that would light the fuse came on the evening of February 23rd. The location was a small oil field community called Ellwood, situated about 12 miles north of Santa Barbara, roughly 100 miles up the coast from Los Angeles. It was around 7 o'clock in the evening, Pacific War time. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was in the middle of one of his famous fireside chats, his reassuring voice crackling over radios across the nation. In Ellwood, workers at the Bankline Oil Company refinery were wrapping up their day. Most had already headed home. Only a skeleton crew remained on duty, performing routine maintenance and keeping an eye on the facility. Approximately 1,000 yards offshore, beneath the darkening Pacific waters, lurked the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-17. The I-17 was a Type B-1 submarine, a formidable vessel stretching 365 feet in length and displacing over 3,600 tons when submerged. She carried a crew of 101 officers and men under the command of Commander Kozo Nishino. Armed with 6 torpedo tubes and a 14-centimeter deck gun, the I-17 had the capability to wreak havoc on coastal installations. At around 7 o'clock, Commander Nishino ordered the I-17 to surface. The submarine breached like some great mechanical whale, water streaming from its hull. The deck gun crew scrambled to action stations, preparing their weapon for firing. Their target was clearly visible in the gathering dusk, a Richfield aviation fuel tank sitting just beyond the beach, a tempting target full of highly volatile fuel. At approximately 7:15, the first shell roared from the I-17's deck gun. The round whistled through the air and exploded near one of the storage facilities. The skeleton crew at the oil field heard the explosion and initially thought something had gone wrong at the refinery itself, perhaps a tank failure or an industrial accident. Then another shell hit, and another. Somebody looked out toward the ocean and spotted the submarine, its dark silhouette visible against the lighter sky. One worker, a man named G. Brown, would later tell reporters that the enemy submarine looked so massive he initially thought it must be a cruiser or destroyer until he realized that only one gun was firing. The reality of what was happening crashed over him. The Japanese were here. They were attacking American soil. This wasn't a drill or a false alarm or a nightmare. This was real. The crew immediately called the police. Sheriff's deputies were notified. Word spread rapidly through the community. Even as they made the calls, Japanese shells continued to fall around them. Commander Nishino, realizing his crew was having difficulty hitting the fuel tanks, ordered them to shift their aim to a second storage facility. The submarine, however, was being buffeted by waves, making accurate fire nearly impossible. Shells fell around the oil field, some striking structures, others passing overhead to land farther inland. One shell sailed over Wheeler's Inn, a local establishment whose owner, Lawrence Wheeler, promptly called the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office. A deputy sheriff assured him that warplanes were already on their way. This assurance, as it turned out, was overly optimistic. No American aircraft would arrive in time to engage the I-17. The bombardment continued for approximately 20 minutes. During that time, the I-17 fired somewhere between 16 and 25 shells, depending on which account you believe. The exact number remains somewhat uncertain even today, as different sources and different witnesses reported different numbers. What's certain is that the submarine pumped a substantial amount of ordnance at the Ellwood oil field. The damage, remarkably, was minimal. The armor-piercing shells the I-17 carried were designed for ship-to-ship combat, with thick steel casings and relatively small explosive charges. They were built to penetrate the thick armor of naval vessels, not to cause widespread destruction at a land-based facility. A derrick was destroyed. A pump house was wrecked. The Ellwood pier suffered minor damage. A catwalk was hit. But the primary targets, those fuel storage tanks that Commander Nishino had set his sights on, remained intact. No massive explosion lit up the coastline. No inferno consumed the oil field. The attack, from a strictly military standpoint, was largely ineffective. But effectiveness and impact are two different things. The psychological impact of the Ellwood bombardment was enormous. This was the first attack by a foreign power on the continental United States since the War of 1812, when British forces had shelled Fort McHenry in Baltimore. Over 127 years had passed since an enemy had fired upon American soil from offshore. Now, less than 3 months after Pearl Harbor, it had happened again. Young J.J. Hollister III, just 10 years old at the time, was listening to President Roosevelt's fireside chat when he heard the distant thunder of cannon fire. In a moment or two, we heard a whistling noise and a thump as a projectile hit near the house, he would later recall. His family scrambled outside and saw bright flashes near the oil field on the shore. Some of the shells made an eerie whistling and caterwauling sound. It was a sickening sound, Hollister said. After 20 minutes of firing, Commander Nishino ordered his gun crew to cease fire. The I-17 slipped beneath the waves and departed the area, safely escaping into the vast Pacific. Nishino would later radio Tokyo, claiming he had left the area in flames, but this was either wishful thinking or deliberate exaggeration. The fires were small and quickly contained. The total damage from the bombardment amounted to approximately $500 worth of repairs. $500. In purely monetary terms, the attack was barely a footnote. But in terms of its effect on American morale and military readiness, it was incalculable. News of the attack spread like wildfire up and down the California coast. Newspapers ran headlines about the shelling. Radio broadcasts carried the news nationwide. The message was clear and terrifying. The Japanese could strike anywhere at any time. The West Coast was not safe. In Los Angeles, just over 100 miles south of Ellwood, military and civilian authorities absorbed the news with growing alarm. If the Japanese could surface a submarine and shell an oil field near Santa Barbara, what was to stop them from doing the same thing off the coast of Los Angeles? Or San Francisco? Or any other coastal city? Anti-aircraft batteries went to an even higher state of alert. Radar operators stared at their screens with renewed intensity. Civilian defense volunteers checked and rechecked their equipment. Perhaps most significantly, the Ellwood bombardment seemed to validate all the fears that had been building since Pearl Harbor. Those who had warned of Japanese attacks on the mainland were proven right. Those who had demanded stronger coastal defenses felt vindicated, and those who harbored suspicions about Japanese Americans living on the West Coast felt their prejudices confirmed. If Japanese submarines could attack at will, who was to say that Japanese Americans weren't signaling them, providing information, acting as a fifth column within America itself? This last suspicion was entirely unfounded, of course. There was never any credible evidence of Japanese-American espionage or sabotage. But in the fevered atmosphere of early 1942, evidence was less important than emotion. Fear was more persuasive than facts, and the fear was very real. Witnesses to the Ellwood attack claimed to have seen signal lights from the shore, allegedly communicating with the submarine. Reverend Arthur Basham of Montecito called police to report that he'd seen the submarine from his home and that the I-17 had turned south toward Los Angeles, apparently flashing lights to someone on shore. In reality, the I-17 had sailed west, safely away from the American coast. But the Reverend's report, however mistaken, fed into the growing narrative of enemy agents operating from within. Blackouts were immediately ordered along the entire Santa Barbara and Ventura coastlines. Every light had to be extinguished. Every window had to be covered. The darkness was absolute, a protective shroud meant to deny enemy vessels any landmarks by which to navigate. But darkness also breeds fear. In the pitch black, every sound becomes ominous. Every shape becomes suspicious. Imagination fills the void left by the absence of sight. The night of February 23rd passed without further incident. The I-17 did not return. No additional submarines appeared. No aircraft materialized overhead. But the damage had been done. Southern California now knew beyond any doubt that the enemy was capable of striking the American mainland. The question wasn't if they would attack again. The question was when and where and in what form. In Los Angeles, the Office of Naval Intelligence issued a warning on the evening of February 24th. An attack on mainland California, they said, could be expected within the next 10 hours. 10 hours, not days, not weeks, hours. The military went to full alert. Anti-aircraft batteries were manned. Radar stations operated at maximum capacity. Searchlight crews stood ready at their equipment. Air raid wardens checked their posts. Civilians went to bed that night, wondering if they would wake to the sound of sirens and explosions. They would. But what they would see in the sky above Los Angeles that night would defy easy explanation, would spark decades of debate and speculation, and would ultimately become one of the most famous and mysterious incidents of the entire war. Before we dive into the chaos of that February night, we need to understand another crucial element of the story. 6 days before the Battle of Los Angeles on February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 906. This order, while not explicitly mentioning Japanese Americans by name, gave broad powers to the Secretary of War to designate military areas from which any or all persons could be excluded. In practice, this meant the forced removal and incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. 2/3 of them were American citizens, born on American soil, raised in American communities, as American as anyone else in the country. That didn't matter. In the climate of fear and suspicion that pervaded 1942 America, ancestry was all that counted. The Japanese American community in Los Angeles was substantial. Many lived and worked in a section of downtown called Little Tokyo. They ran businesses, owned property, participated in civic life. They were neighbors, co-workers, friends. But in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, they found themselves viewed with suspicion by people who had known them for years. Japanese ancestry became synonymous with potential traitor. Cultural heritage became evidence of divided loyalty. The fact that these were American citizens seemed irrelevant to many of their fellow Americans. The suspicion wasn't entirely organic. It was fed by politicians, by newspapers, by influential columnists who should have known better. Walter Lippmann, whose columns reached readers across the nation, argued that the only reason Japanese Americans hadn't been caught plotting sabotage was that they were waiting for the most effective moment to strike. Westbrook Pegler was even more blunt. The Japanese in California should be under armed guard to the last man and woman right now, and to hell with habeas corpus until the danger is over. To hell with habeas corpus, the ancient legal principle that protects individuals from arbitrary imprisonment, a cornerstone of Western jurisprudence, was to be discarded because of ancestry. This was the rhetoric of the time. This was what passed for reasoned discourse in early 1942. Military leaders, some of them high-ranking and influential, pushed for mass removal. General John L. DeWitt, who commanded the Western Defense Command that included California, Oregon, and Washington, famously stated, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether the Jap is a citizen or not." This casual racism, this complete dismissal of constitutional rights based purely on ethnicity, came from a man responsible for defending American territory and American citizens. Executive Order 906 provided the legal framework for what would follow. Under its authority, military commanders designated exclusion zones along the West Coast. Japanese Americans living in these zones were given notice to report for evacuation. They were allowed to bring only what they could carry. They had days, sometimes just 48 hours, to settle their affairs, to sell or store their possessions, to make arrangements for their homes and businesses. The economic devastation was staggering. Property that had taken lifetimes to accumulate had to be sold in a matter of days, often at fire sale prices, to opportunistic buyers who knew the sellers had no choice. Businesses were shuttered. Farms were abandoned, personal belongings were left behind. The total property loss has been estimated at $1.3 billion in 1983 dollars. The net income loss at $2.7 billion. These aren't just numbers. They represent destroyed livelihoods, shattered dreams, the accumulated work of generations. Families gathered at designated assembly points, each person wearing an identification tag, their few possessions piled around them. From these assembly points, they were transported to hastily constructed camps in remote locations. Santa Anita Park, a racetrack in Southern California, became one such assembly center. Families were housed in horse stalls with dirt floors. The irony, the indignity of it, is hard to overstate. American citizens imprisoned in animal stalls because of their ancestry. From the assembly centers, families were eventually moved to more permanent relocation centers, though calling them that obscures their true nature. These were concentration camps, prison camps, internment facilities surrounded by barbed wire and watched over by armed guards. 10 such camps were established: Manzanar and Tule Lake in California, Poston and Gila River in Arizona, Topaz in Utah, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Granada in Colorado, Minidoka in Idaho, and Jerome and Rower in Arkansas. Living conditions in these camps were harsh. Families lived in tar paper barracks, poorly insulated against summer heat and winter cold. Privacy was minimal. Facilities were shared. The camps were located in remote areas, often desert regions where temperatures could swing wildly between day and night. These were places designed not for rehabilitation or even for comfortable detention, but simply for isolation. Keep them away from the coast, keep them where they can't signal submarines or sabotage war production. That was the thinking, flawed and prejudiced as it was. All of this was happening in the context of the Battle of Los Angeles. Executive Order 9066 was signed on February 19th. The battle occurred on February 25th. The Ellwood bombardment happened on February 23rd. These events were happening in rapid succession, each feeding the others, each amplifying the fear and suspicion that gripped Southern California. During the Battle of Los Angeles, authorities arrested 20 Japanese Americans for allegedly violating the blackout. In some cases, the violations were minor and probably accidental. One man was arrested for driving a truck carrying cauliflower after the air raid siren had sounded, but 15 of the 20 were arrested for alleged fifth column activities. Several were accused of signaling to the supposed enemy aircraft overhead. The fact that there almost certainly were no enemy aircraft overhead, that the entire incident was likely a false alarm or mass hysteria, didn't matter. The accusations were made, the arrests were carried out. Japanese Americans became convenient scapegoats for an embarrassing military fiasco. The Battle of Los Angeles, in this sense, served as a kind of capstone to the process that Executive Order 9066 had begun. Here was proof, or what passed for proof in that fevered climate, that the threat was real, that Japanese Americans couldn't be trusted, that removal and incarceration were necessary for public safety. Never mind that no evidence of sabotage or espionage was ever produced. Never mind that the Japanese government itself would later state it had flown no aircraft over Los Angeles that night. The narrative had taken hold, and facts were powerless against it. Looking back from our vantage point in the 21st century, it's easy to condemn the internment of Japanese Americans as the grave injustice it was. The US government formally apologized in 1988, 46 years after the fact. Reparations were paid, $20,000 to each person who had been incarcerated. But no amount of money can truly compensate for years stolen, for businesses destroyed, for the violation of constitutional rights, for the message sent to American citizens that their citizenship meant nothing in the face of wartime hysteria and racial prejudice. The Battle of Los Angeles needs to be understood in this broader context. It wasn't just a military incident or a case of mistaken identity. It was part of a larger pattern of fear, suspicion, and the willingness to abandon fundamental principles in the name of security. What happened in the skies over Los Angeles that night would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate damage from falling shells. The evening of February 24th, 1942, began quietly enough in Los Angeles. The sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As darkness fell, the city followed the blackout procedures that had become routine since Pearl Harbor. Windows were covered, streetlights remained dark. The sprawling metropolis, normally ablaze with light, lay hidden beneath a blanket of darkness. At 7:18 in the evening, an alert was called. The Office of Naval Intelligence's warning from earlier that day, predicting an attack within 10 hours, had people on edge. Reports came in of flares and blinking lights near defense plants. Were these signals to incoming aircraft, evidence of sabotage, or just imagination running wild? The alert remained in effect for several hours. then was lifted at 10:23. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief. False alarm, or so it seemed. Military radar operators continued their vigilant watch throughout the night. Radar technology in 1942 was still primitive by modern standards. The SER-268 units deployed for coastal defense operated with limited range, approximately 22 miles, and were prone to false echoes from weather phenomena, ground clutter, and atmospheric conditions. Reading a radar screen required skill and experience, both of which were often in short supply among young operators who had received only basic training. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, radar stations detected something. The official record states that an unidentified object or objects were tracked about 120 miles west of Los Angeles. The contact appeared on multiple screens. It was moving toward the coast. Operators watched as the target drew closer, mile by mile, until it was just a few miles offshore. At 2:21 in the morning, the regional controller ordered a blackout. This was more comprehensive than the earlier alert. This was the real thing. Within moments, air raid sirens began their mournful wailing across Los Angeles County. The sound carried for miles, piercing the night, jolting people from sleep, sending hearts racing and adrenaline surging. Thousands of air raid wardens scrambled to their posts. These were civilian volunteers, men and women who had trained for exactly this scenario. They donned their helmets, grabbed their flashlights, and rushed out into the darkened streets to enforce the blackout and help coordinate the civilian response. At military installations throughout the Los Angeles area, anti-aircraft gun crews rushed to their weapons. The 37th Coast Artillery Brigade, responsible for the city's air defense, went to full alert. But in the early hours of February 25th, confusion already reigned. Reports flooded into the information center. Enemy planes near Long Beach. Aircraft spotted over Santa Monica. A Coast Artillery colonel reported seeing about 25 planes at 12,000 feet over Los Angeles. At 3:06 in the morning, a report came in of a balloon carrying a red flare over Santa Monica. And at that moment, the guns opened fire. 4 batteries of anti-aircraft artillery began pumping shells into the night sky. The sound was tremendous, unlike anything most Los Angeles residents had ever heard. The deep, rhythmic boom of the anti-aircraft guns, the sharper crack of 50 caliber machine guns, the whistle of shells tearing through the air, the brilliant flash of explosions thousands of feet overhead. Orange tracer rounds painted lines of fire across the darkness. Shell bursts illuminated the sky in brief, brilliant flashes. Searchlights swept back and forth, their powerful beams creating a web of light against the black void. Smoke from the explosions began to accumulate, drifting on the wind, creating an eerie haze that caught the searchlight beams and scattered them in strange patterns. For residents of Los Angeles, the experience was surreal and terrifying. Despite the blackout orders, thousands of people ignored the instructions to stay inside. They poured into their streets and yards, some still in their nightclothes, staring up at the spectacle unfolding above them. Some described it as the most magnificent and frightening thing they had ever seen. Others were too terrified to appreciate the visual display, convinced they were witnessing the beginning of the end. The firing continued sporadically until 4:14 in the morning. In that time, more than 1,400 shells were fired into the sky over Los Angeles. 1,400 rounds. That's not a brief exchange of fire. That's not a few nervous gunners squeezing off a handful of shots. That's a sustained barrage, a determined attempt to destroy whatever was up there in the darkness above the city. Eyewitness accounts from that night are fascinating in their variety and their contradictions. Some people swore they saw aircraft, not just one or two, but formations of them caught in the searchlight beams. They described seeing planes maneuvering, taking evasive action, moving in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. Some claimed they saw as many as 50 aircraft. Others said fewer, but still substantial numbers. But other witnesses saw something different. They described a large, slow-moving object, balloon-like in appearance, most clearly visible when caught at the convergence of multiple searchlight beams. This object, whatever it was, didn't seem to move like an airplane. It drifted rather than flew. It appeared to hover at times, and despite being bracketed by exploding shells, it seemed undamaged, continuing on its path across the Los Angeles sky. Still other witnesses, including some experienced military observers, claimed they saw nothing at all. Colonel John G. Murphy of the Coastal Artillery Corps would later write, "Imagination could have easily disclosed many shapes in the sky in the midst of that weird symphony of noise and color, but cold detachment disclosed no planes of any type in the sky, friendly or enemy." Murphy stood there, listening to the thunder of his own guns, watching the searchlights sweep the heavens and seeing absolutely nothing that justified the barrage. Famous war correspondent Ernie Pyle was in Los Angeles that night. So was journalist Bill Henry. Both were experienced observers who had seen combat in other theaters. Both watched the Battle of Los Angeles unfold, and both later wrote that they never saw any aircraft in the sky, despite the intensity of the anti-aircraft fire and the absolute certainty of many other witnesses that planes were overhead. The 4th Interceptor Command, responsible for scrambling fighter planes to engage enemy aircraft, received the alert. Pilots rushed to their aircraft, engines were started, planes taxied into position. But the order to take off never came. The commanders needed to identify the scale and direction of any attack before committing their limited fighter force, so the fighters sat there, engines running, pilots ready, waiting for an order that would never arrive. When the sun came up and the all-clear sounded, those planes had never left the ground. Why keep the fighters grounded during what appeared to be a massive enemy air raid? The official explanation was prudent caution. Don't commit your fighters until you know what you're up against. Don't send them up piecemeal to be destroyed. Wait until you have a clear picture of the threat. But there's another possible explanation. The people in command weren't entirely sure there was anything up there to shoot at. The radar contacts were ambiguous. The visual reports were contradictory. Maybe, just maybe, this was all a terrible mistake. If it was a mistake, it was an expensive one. As the minutes and hours wore on, anti-aircraft shells rained down across Los Angeles. Some exploded in the air as designed. Others, their fuses faulty or improperly set, failed to detonate and fell back to Earth as deadly projectiles. A 3-inch anti-aircraft shell weighs roughly 13 pounds. When it falls from several thousand feet, it has more than enough kinetic energy to destroy property and kill people. Homes were struck by falling shells and shrapnel. Windows shattered across the city. Cars were damaged. One unexploded shell buried itself in a golf course in Long Beach. Another destroyed part of a home, thankfully after the residents had fled outside to watch the battle. Had they remained in their bedrooms, they almost certainly would have been killed. The chaos extended beyond just the falling ordnance. With the city in total blackout and air raid sirens wailing, traffic accidents were inevitable. Drivers, unable to use their headlights, peered desperately into the darkness while simultaneously craning their necks to look up at the explosions overhead. 3 people died in traffic accidents that night. One of them was Sergeant Engelbert Larson of the Los Angeles Police Department, who died in a vehicle collision while responding to an emergency call. 2 other people suffered fatal heart attacks brought on by the stress and excitement of the raid. Harry Ayres of the California State Guard had a heart attack while driving a munitions truck. George P. Well, an air raid warden likewise died from a heart attack. These weren't direct combat casualties in the traditional sense, but they were absolutely casualties of the Battle of Los Angeles. By the time the all-clear sounded at 7:21 in the morning, the city was exhausted, terrified, and thoroughly confused. What had just happened? Had they been attacked? If so, by what? Where were the bomb craters? Where were the downed aircraft? Why had nothing been hit except by their own anti-aircraft fire? One of the most fascinating and frustrating aspects of the Battle of Los Angeles is the sheer variety of eyewitness testimony. Thousands of people watched the incident unfold. Thousands of pairs of eyes looked up at the same sky, at the same searchlights, at the same explosions. And yet, what they reported seeing varied wildly. Let's start with the military observers, the trained personnel who should theoretically have been the most reliable witnesses. At 2:43 in the morning, military observers reported unidentified planes between Seal Beach and Long Beach. Just a few minutes later, a Coast Artillery colonel reported seeing about 25 planes at 12,000 feet over Los Angeles. 25 planes. That's not a scouting mission, that's a substantial attack force. But at 3:06, the report changed. Now it was a balloon carrying a red flare seen over Santa Monica. One balloon. Not 25 planes. One balloon with a flare. This was the sighting that triggered the opening barrage. 4 batteries of anti-aircraft artillery saw this balloon, or thought they saw it, and opened fire. And once they opened fire, all hell broke loose. A declassified military report from February 1942 provides a detailed timeline of the reports that came in that night. At 2:43, unidentified planes between Seal Beach and Long Beach. At 3:06, a balloon carrying a red flare over Santa Monica, upon which 482 rounds of 3-inch shells were expended. The report goes on to list aircraft appearing over Long Beach, over Redondo Beach, over other locations around the Los Angeles area, each sighting prompting hundreds of additional rounds of ammunition to be fired. In total, the report documents more than 16 military eyewitness accounts describing everything from weather balloons to 30 Japanese planes flying in a menacing V formation over the city, 16 trained military observers, 16 completely different descriptions of what was in the sky. Some saw one object, others saw dozens. Some saw planes, others saw balloons. Some saw nothing at all. Civilian witnesses were no more consistent. Many described seeing a large, slow-moving object that caught and reflected the searchlight beams. This object, whatever it was, seemed to move at a leisurely pace across the sky, perhaps covering 20 miles in approximately 30 minutes. That's about 40 miles per hour, much too slow for any conventional aircraft of the era. Katie, a local resident, whose full name has been lost to history, gave one of the more detailed civilian accounts. She described watching anti-aircraft searchlights completely surrounding an object in the sky. She claimed that fighter planes were sent up and that she watched them approach the object in groups before turning away. They were shooting at it, but it didn't seem to matter, she said. It was like the 4th of July, but much louder. They were firing like crazy, but they couldn't touch it. Katie's account is interesting for several reasons. First, she claimed to have seen fighter planes attacking the object, but we know from official records that no fighters were scrambled that night. The 4th Interceptor Command kept its aircraft on the ground, so either Katie misidentified anti-aircraft shell bursts as fighter planes, or she was mistaken about what she saw, or she was embellishing her account. In the chaos and confusion of that night, any of these explanations is possible. But Katie's description of the object itself matches what many other witnesses reported, something that seemed impervious to the anti-aircraft fire. "I'll never forget what a magnificent sight it was," Katie said. "Just marvelous, and what a gorgeous color." This doesn't sound like someone describing an attack. This sounds like someone describing a spectacle, something beautiful and strange and completely outside normal experience. Other witnesses described seeing formations of aircraft, bombers flying in precise patterns. Some claimed they counted as many as 50 planes overhead. They described seeing them illuminated by searchlights, caught in the brilliant white beams like insects trapped in some cosmic web. These witnesses were absolutely convinced they were watching a Japanese bombing raid. Yet other witnesses saw different things entirely. Some reported seeing only the searchlights and shell bursts, with no discernible objects in the sky at all. Some described seeing strange lights, unidentified shapes, things that moved in ways that conventional aircraft didn't move. Fast, then slow. Stationary, then rapidly accelerating. Rising vertically, then moving horizontally. The descriptions defy any consistent pattern. An employee of the Los Angeles Herald-Express stated that he was certain many of the artillery shells had struck their target, but had no effect whatsoever. Think about that for a moment. 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition fired into the sky. High explosive shells designed to destroy bombers. And according to this witness, many of them found their target but caused no damage. What kind of aircraft could withstand direct hits from anti-aircraft shells and continue flying unaffected? The famous photograph published in the Los Angeles Times on February 26th shows what appears to be an object caught in multiple searchlight beams, surrounded by bursting shells. The image has become iconic, reproduced thousands of times, analyzed by researchers, cited by UFO enthusiasts as proof of extraterrestrial visitation. We'll discuss that photograph in more detail later, but for now, it's worth noting that this single image has probably done more to shape public perception of the Battle of Los Angeles than any written account. The psychological dynamics at play that night were complex and powerful. Consider the situation. People had been told to expect an attack. The warning from the Office of Naval Intelligence said an assault could come within 10 hours. Just 2 nights earlier, a Japanese submarine had shelled an oil field up the coast. The city was blacked out. Radar had detected something approaching from the sea. Air raid sirens were wailing. Then the guns started firing. In that environment, with adrenaline surging and fear gripping hearts, the human mind becomes incredibly susceptible to suggestion and misperception. Searchlights sweeping the sky create patterns. Shell bursts in the darkness create flashes of light. Smoke drifting through the searchlight beams creates shapes. And the brain, desperately trying to make sense of the chaos, imposes meaning on those patterns and shapes. It sees what it expects to see, or what it fears to see, or what it hopes to see. This phenomenon, known in psychology as pareidolia, is the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or ambiguous stimuli. It's why we see faces in clouds, why we see animals in ink blots, why, in the midst of a chaotic night with searchlights and explosions and smoke, we might see aircraft that aren't really there. Add to this the power of suggestion. Once one person reports seeing planes, others start seeing them too. Once the guns open fire, everyone assumes there must be something to shoot at. Why else would trained military personnel be firing over 1,000 shells into the sky? There must be something up there. And so people look harder, strain their eyes in the darkness, and convince themselves they see what they've been told to expect. But pareidolia and suggestion don't explain everything. They don't explain the radar contacts that initiated the alert. They don't explain why multiple independent observers, including experienced military personnel, reported seeing objects in the sky. They don't explain the remarkable consistency of reports describing a large, slow-moving object that seemed impervious to anti-aircraft fire. The truth is, we don't have a complete explanation for what happened that night. We have pieces of the puzzle, but they don't quite fit together into a coherent picture. And that uncertainty, that gap between what we know and what we can prove, has kept the Battle of Los Angeles alive in public imagination for over 8 decades. When dawn broke over Los Angeles on the morning of February 25th, the city looked like it had been through a war. In a sense, it had. Shell fragments littered the streets. Unexploded ordnance lay scattered across neighborhoods. Buildings bore the scars of shrapnel impact. Windows were shattered. Vehicles were damaged. In 3 cases, people's bedrooms had been struck by shells or fragments. Fortunately, those residents had gone outside to watch the spectacle, and weren't in their rooms when the shells hit. 5 people were dead, 3 killed in traffic accidents during the blackout, 2 felled by heart attacks. These casualties weren't the result of enemy action. They were casualties of panic, of confusion, of a city that had convinced itself it was under attack and had responded with tragic consequences. One particularly unfortunate incident involved a farmer whose cattle herd stampeded during the barrage. The explosions terrified the animals, sending them running in all directions. One cow was struck and killed by an exploding shell. The farmer spent hours trying to round up his scattered herd, dealing with the very real consequences of a very unreal attack. Cleanup crews fanned out across the city to deal with unexploded shells. A 3-inch anti-aircraft shell is not something to take lightly. Even if it failed to detonate in the air, it still contains enough explosive to cause significant damage if it goes off on the ground. Bomb disposal teams carefully located and secured these duds. In one case, an unexploded shell landed in a residential area, and the entire street was cordoned off with signs reading, "Danger, unexploded bomb." One particularly interesting shell was recovered at Silsby Spaulding's Tecolote Ranch in Winchester Canyon. This shell had not exploded, and it was in relatively intact condition. The family contacted the US Army, which confiscated the munition and transported it to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for study. After several years and many communications, the Army defused the shell and returned it to the Spaulding family, where it became a family heirloom. That shell now resides in the Carriage and Western Art Museum of Santa Barbara, a tangible artifact from that chaotic night. But physical damage and casualties, as significant as they were, paled in comparison to the confusion and controversy that erupted in the aftermath. What had the military just fired 1,400 shells at? Where were the downed aircraft? Where were the bomb craters? Where was any evidence whatsoever of an actual enemy attack? The Army's Western Defense Command issued a statement that carefully avoided answering those questions. Although reports were conflicting and every effort is being made to ascertain the facts, it is clear that no bombs were dropped and no planes were shot down. Clear that no bombs were dropped, clear that no planes were shot down. But notably absent from this statement was any assertion about whether planes had actually been overhead. The statement acknowledged the lack of results, but remained silent on the question of whether there had been anything to shoot at in the first place. Later that same day, military authorities held press conferences and issued statements that only deepened the confusion. The incident became a kind of Rorschach test, with different officials seeing completely different things in the same set of facts. In the days following the Battle of Los Angeles, government officials scrambled to explain what had happened. The problem was that nobody seemed to agree on the basic facts. Was it an attack? A false alarm? A test of civilian readiness? Different officials gave radically different answers, creating a public relations disaster that in some ways was worse than the incident itself. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, held a press conference where he dismissed the entire affair as a false alarm. "As far as I know," Knox stated, "the whole raid was a false alarm and could be attributed to jittery nerves." Jittery nerves. Knox's statement couldn't have been more dismissive. In his view, there had been no attack, no enemy aircraft, no threat whatsoever. The military had fired over 1,400 shells at nothing because they were nervous. This explanation did not sit well with many people. If it was just jittery nerves, why did radar detect an incoming contact? Why did multiple military observers report seeing aircraft? Why did the barrage continue for nearly an hour? Knox's statement seemed to suggest that the entire coastal defense system had failed spectacularly, that trained military personnel couldn't tell the difference between real threats and imaginary ones. But then, just a day later, Secretary of War Henry Stimson offered a completely different account. According to Stimson, 15 unidentified aircraft had indeed flown over Los Angeles. These weren't figments of jittery imaginations. These were real planes, and Stimson had a theory about where they came from. He suggested they might be commercial aircraft operated by enemy agents from secret airfields in California or Mexico, or possibly light planes launched from Japanese submarines. 15 planes, commercial aircraft operated by enemy agents, secret airfields, submarine-launched aircraft. This wasn't just a different interpretation of the events. This was a completely different narrative. Knox said nothing happened. Stimson said 15 enemy aircraft attacked Los Angeles. Stimson went further, speculating about the purpose of such an attack. The goal, he suggested, might have been to locate anti-aircraft defenses in the area or to damage civilian morale. He even made a pointed remark aimed at Knox. My only comment is that perhaps it is better to be too alert than not enough. The divergence between Knox and Stimson created a public relations nightmare. Here were two high-ranking government officials, both supposedly privy to the same intelligence, offering completely contradictory accounts of what had happened. If they couldn't agree on the basic facts, how was the public supposed to know what to believe? The Los Angeles Times published a front-page editorial titled "Information Please" that captured the public's frustration. More specific public information should be forthcoming from the government, if only to clarify their own conflicting statements about it. Apparently, the Army's information was that enemy planes were here and preparing for an attack, then or later. Accordingly, it blacked out, started searchlights, opened fire and kept on firing for a long time. Secretary Knox's information, he says, is that there were no planes at all, and that the whole thing was a false alarm. On this basis, he apparently predicates expression of a belief that such things will make it necessary to remove Pacific Coast war industries inland. The reasoning is at least extraordinary. If there were no planes and no danger, wherein does this particular incident in any way support the theory that our great aircraft industry should be moved inland? The editorial made an excellent point. Knox's false alarm explanation actually made things worse, not better. If the military couldn't tell the difference between a real attack and an imaginary one, how could anyone feel safe? If 1,400 shells were fired at nothing, what did that say about the competence of coastal defenses? And why would such an incident justify moving war industries inland if there had been no actual threat? Representative Leland Ford of Santa Monica demanded a congressional investigation. He characterized the episode as complete mystification and insisted that none of the explanations so far offered removed the episode from the category of complete mystification. This was either a practice raid, or a raid to throw a scare into 2 million people, or a mistaken identity raid, or a raid to lay a political foundation to take away Southern California's war industries. Ford's statement reveals the level of suspicion and confusion that the incident generated. Was it a drill that nobody had been told about? Was it a deliberate attempt to terrorize the civilian population? Was it a case of mistaken identity? Or was there some political motive behind it all? The fact that a congressman could seriously entertain all these possibilities shows just how thoroughly the conflicting official statements had undermined public confidence. The New York Times weighed in with its own editorial, noting that eyewitness accounts varied wildly. Some reported seeing a big floating object resembling a balloon. Others claimed to have seen anywhere from one plane to several dozen. The more the whole incident of the early morning of February 25th in the Los Angeles district is examined, the editorial concluded, the more incredible it becomes. Adding to the confusion, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army General George C. Marshall initially supported Stimson's account, suggesting that enemy agents might be flying commercial airplanes over the mainland to cause mass hysteria. But Marshall would later backpedal from this claim, offering no clear alternative explanation. Stimson himself would eventually soften his position, but he never fully retracted his claim that aircraft had been overhead. The discrepancy between his account and Knox's remained unresolved, a permanent blemish on the official record. So what actually happened? The conflicting official statements make it difficult to determine, but we can piece together a likely sequence of events from the available evidence. First, radar did detect something approaching the coast from about 120 miles out. Multiple radar stations picked up the contact, so this wasn't a single operator's error. Something was out there, at least as far as the radar was concerned. Second, the radar contact disappeared or became intermittent as it approached the coast. This suggests either that the object descended below the radar's detection threshold, or that atmospheric conditions affected the radar return, or that the object was something ephemeral like a weather balloon that changed altitude or burst. Third, once visual observers started reporting seeing things, the reports proliferated rapidly. This is consistent with a combination of actual phenomena, searchlights, shell bursts, smoke, and psychological factors, suggestion, pareidolia, expectation. Fourth, the sustained nature of the barrage suggests that something kept the gunners convinced they had a target, whether that was actual visual contact with an object, or the continuing arrival of reports from other observers, or simply the momentum of the engagement once it started is unclear. Fifth, the complete absence of any physical evidence of enemy aircraft, the failure to shoot down anything despite 1,400 shells fired, and the lack of any bomb damage all point toward there being no actual enemy attack. What emerges from this analysis is a picture of a genuine radar contact that may have been a weather balloon or atmospheric phenomenon, followed by mass misidentification of searchlight patterns and shell bursts as enemy aircraft, all amplified by the extraordinary tension and fear that gripped Los Angeles in late February 1942. But that explanation, while plausible, leaves some questions unanswered. If it was just a weather balloon and mass hysteria, why did experienced military observers report seeing aircraft? Why did the reports describe a large object that seemed to move in a controlled manner across the sky? Why did some observers claim the object was struck by shells but continued on undamaged? In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Los Angeles, various theories circulated about what had actually happened. Some of these theories were reasonable, others were less so, and as decades passed and the incident receded into history, new theories would emerge, particularly as the UFO phenomenon captured public imagination in the late 1940s and beyond. The most official explanation came from the United States Coast Artillery Association in 1949. According to their analysis, a meteorological balloon had been sent aloft at 1 o'clock in the morning on February the 25th. This balloon, they concluded, started all the shooting. Once the firing began, imagination created all kinds of targets in the sky, and everyone joined in. This explanation has the virtue of simplicity and plausibility. Weather balloons were routinely used to determine wind conditions, particularly when anti-aircraft batteries needed to calculate firing solutions. Such balloons were typically illuminated and had a silvery appearance that could easily be mistaken for an aircraft, especially in the dark when caught in searchlight beams. Once one battery opened fire on the balloon, other batteries would follow suit, and the combination of smoke, searchlights, and shell bursts would create the illusion of multiple targets. The 1949 report goes on to note that anti-aircraft artillery units were officially criticized for wasting ammunition on targets that moved too slowly to have been airplanes. This is a crucial detail. If the targets were moving too slowly to be aircraft, that strongly suggests they were either balloons or shell bursts being mistaken for aircraft. However, this explanation sat dormant for decades until the U.S. Office of Air Force History conducted a more thorough investigation in 1983. Their report, published as part of the Army Air Forces in World War II, Volume 1, provided the most detailed official analysis of the incident. The 1980 report began by examining the context. U.S. military defenses in California were already on a hair trigger due to the Japanese submarine attack on the Ellwood oil field just 2 nights earlier. Naval intelligence had warned that an attack could be expected within 10 hours. In this environment, any unusual radar contact or visual sighting would be taken very seriously. The report then examined the sequence of events on the night of February 24th to 25. At 2:21 in the morning, radar tracked an approaching target to within a few miles of the coast. A blackout was ordered, but then Curiously, the radar contact seems to have vanished. The information center was flooded with reports of enemy planes, but the mysterious object tracked from the sea had disappeared from the screens. At 2:43, planes were reported near Long Beach. A few minutes later, a Coast Artillery colonel spotted about 25 planes at 12,000 feet over Los Angeles. But at 3:06, the report changed to a balloon carrying a red flare seen over Santa Monica. This balloon sighting triggered the opening barrage. The Air Force historians concluded that the air over Los Angeles erupted like a volcano, based on the sighting of what was likely a weather balloon. From that point on, reports became hopelessly contradictory. The next 3 hours produced what the report called some of the most imaginative reporting of the war. Witnesses described swarms of planes, or sometimes balloons, of all possible sizes, numbering from 1 to several hundred, traveling at altitudes ranging from a few thousand feet to more than 20,000, flying at speeds that varied from very slow to over 200 miles per hour. These mysterious forces dropped no bombs and, despite 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition directed at them, suffered no losses. The 1983 report strongly suggests that much of the confusion came from a simple but significant misidentification. Anti-aircraft shell bursts, caught by searchlights, were themselves mistaken for enemy planes. This makes sense. When a shell explodes at high altitude, it creates a bright flash. When searchlight beams illuminate that flash, it could easily look like an aircraft caught in the light. Each new explosion creates a new aircraft, and to observers on the ground, it would appear that multiple planes were moving through the sky as the searchlights tracked from one burst to another. The Air Force conclusion attributed the event to a combination of war nerves and meteorological balloons. The initial radar contact may have been a weather balloon. Visual sightings of the balloon triggered the barrage. Once the shooting started, shell bursts and smoke created the illusion of multiple targets, which were then reported as enemy aircraft, which in turn prompted more firing, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of misidentification and response. This explanation has become the generally accepted historical consensus. It accounts for most of the known facts. It explains why there was no enemy damage. It explains the contradictory reports. It explains why nothing was shot down despite the massive barrage. But this explanation, while compelling, rests on some assumptions that are worth examining. First, it assumes that experienced military observers, including officers and gunners, who had been trained in aircraft identification, could be fooled by weather balloons and shell bursts for nearly an hour. Is that reasonable? Perhaps, given the circumstances, the darkness, the smoke, and the general chaos. But it's still a significant assumption. Second, it assumes that the radar contacts were caused by meteorological balloons, but radar in 1942 had difficulty detecting small objects like weather balloons. Most radar contacts from balloons occurred when the balloon was carrying a metallic reflector to make it more visible. Were such reflectors used on the balloons released that night? The historical record is unclear. Third, the weather balloon explanation doesn't account for all the eyewitness testimony. Some observers described seeing a large object that moved across the sky in a controlled manner, taking approximately 30 minutes to traverse 20 miles. A balloon drifting on the wind wouldn't necessarily move in such a consistent, controlled fashion. After the war ended in 1945, the Japanese government made a definitive statement. They had flown no aircraft over Los Angeles during the war. No bombers, no reconnaissance planes, no submarine-launched aircraft. Nothing. This statement has never been credibly challenged. Japanese military records, which were extensively examined after the war, show no missions against Los Angeles in February 1942 or at any other time during the conflict. This Japanese denial supports the weather balloon explanation. If it wasn't Japanese aircraft and it wasn't American aircraft and nobody shot anything down or found any wreckage, then it probably wasn't aircraft at all. It was either an atmospheric phenomenon, a misidentification, mass hysteria, or some combination thereof. However, there's one more theory that emerged in subsequent decades, one that the 1983 Air Force report didn't address, the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The Battle of Los Angeles didn't become associated with UFOs immediately. In 1942, the term flying saucer didn't exist. The modern UFO phenomenon wouldn't begin until 1947, when pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing unusual aircraft near Mount Rainier in Washington state. It was Arnold's description of objects that moved like a saucer skipping across water that gave birth to the term flying saucer and sparked a wave of sightings across America. But once the UFO phenomenon had taken hold of public imagination, researchers began looking back through historical records for earlier incidents that might represent extraterrestrial visitation. And the Battle of Los Angeles, with its mysterious objects, its sustained military response, and its lack of conventional explanation, seemed to fit the bill. The first person to connect the Battle of Los Angeles to flying saucers appears to have been Raymond Palmer, a writer and editor who published a science fiction story in Amazing Stories magazine in 1947 that referenced the incident. Palmer's story was fiction, but it planted a seed. If unidentified objects could be in our skies in 1947, might they have been there in 1942 as well? In 1952, during another banner year for UFO sightings, Los Angeles Times columnist Bill Henry wrote a piece responding to contemporary UFO reports by referencing the Battle of Los Angeles. Henry's take was skeptical. He argued that the 1942 incident demonstrated how mass hysteria could conjure non-existent objects into the sky, and he suggested the current UFO wave was just more of the same. But in 1907, Kenneth Larson, who had served as an air raid warden during the Battle of Los Angeles, published an article in Flying Saucers Pictorial magazine arguing that the searchlights that night had tracked a genuine flying saucer. Larson's credentials as an actual witness to the event lent weight to his claims, and his article sparked renewed interest in the incident among UFO researchers. In 1968, Gordon Law and Harold Deneau of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena published a book called Mysteries of the Skies that featured the Battle of Los Angeles prominently. They argued that the military response that night was too sustained and too intense to have been directed at weather balloons or nothing at all. Something solid must have been in the sky over Los Angeles, and if it wasn't Japanese aircraft, then what was it? Central to the UFO interpretation of the Battle of Los Angeles is the famous photograph published in the Los Angeles Times on February 26, 1942. This image shows multiple searchlight beams converging on what appears to be a solid object in the sky with anti-aircraft shell bursts surrounding it. The photograph has become iconic in UFO literature, reproduced in countless books and documentaries, analyzed and reanalyzed by believers and skeptics alike. The photograph appears to show exactly what UFO proponents claim: a disc-shaped or football-shaped object caught in searchlight beams, apparently impervious to the anti-aircraft fire bursting around it. If you squint at the image, you can almost make out a solid form at the convergence of the searchlights. To believers, this is smoking gun evidence of an extraterrestrial spacecraft over Los Angeles in 1942. But there's a problem with this photograph, a problem that wasn't widely known until 2011, when Los Angeles Times writer Larry Harnish conducted a detailed investigation into the image's provenance. What Harnish discovered was that the famous photograph had been heavily retouched before publication. Photo retouching in the 1940s was standard practice in newspaper production. Black and white photographs often didn't reproduce well in newsprint. To improve contrast and make details more visible, photo editors would literally paint on the photographs with white paint, darkening shadows and highlighting bright areas. This was considered acceptable journalistic practice at the time, though it would be completely unacceptable by modern standards. When Harnish examined the original negatives of the Battle of Los Angeles photographs at UCLA's archives, he found something interesting. There were two versions of the famous searchlight image. One was the original, unretouched negative. The other was a copy negative made from the retouched print. The unretouched version of the photograph is dramatically different from the published version. In the original, the image is flat, the focus is soft, and it appears underexposed. Most significantly, the distinct object that appears at the convergence of the searchlights in the published version is barely visible in the original. What looks like a solid, disc-shaped craft in the retouched image is just a diffuse blob of light in the original, likely the convergence of the searchlight beams themselves creating an optical effect. In the retouched version, many searchlight beams were lightened and widened with white paint, while other beams were eliminated entirely. The object at the center was enhanced to make it more visible. The result was an image that appeared to show something solid in the sky, when the original negative showed nothing of the sort. This revelation doesn't prove that nothing was in the sky that night, but it does eliminate the photograph as credible evidence of a solid object. What the photograph actually shows is searchlights, smoke, and shell bursts artistically enhanced to make a dramatic image for the newspaper. The fact that this retouched image has been presented for decades as authentic photographic evidence of a UFO is, at best, a case of misunderstanding the practices of 1940s photojournalism. At worst, it's deliberate deception. The photo retouching revelation hasn't ended the UFO interpretation of the Battle of Los Angeles, however. Believers argue that the eyewitness testimony alone is sufficient to establish that something anomalous was in the sky that night. They point to reports of an object that moved slowly, hovered at times, and seemed impervious to anti-aircraft fire. They note that Japanese denial of having aircraft over Los Angeles leaves the question of what was there unanswered. Some UFO researchers have developed elaborate theories about what might have happened. One popular theory suggests that an extraterrestrial craft was investigating Earth in early 1942, perhaps monitoring the military conflict then raging across the planet. According to this theory, the craft was detected by radar and engaged by the Los Angeles anti-aircraft batteries, but its advanced technology allowed it to withstand the barrage without damage. This theory has several problems. First, it assumes extraterrestrial visitors would use technology that appears on primitive radar, but is immune to explosive shells, which seems like an odd combination. Second, it doesn't explain why such a craft would spend nearly an hour drifting slowly across Los Angeles, instead of simply leaving the area quickly. Third, it requires us to reject all conventional explanations in favor of an extraordinary one without extraordinary evidence to support it. Dr. Bruce Maccabee, an optical physicist who has researched the Battle of Los Angeles extensively, has examined the famous photograph and concluded that it does show something interrupting the searchlight beams. His analysis suggests that a physical object of some kind was present. However, even Maccabee acknowledges that this doesn't prove the object was extraterrestrial. It could have been a balloon, a blimp, or some other conventional object. The Battle of Los Angeles has also featured prominently in popular culture, further cementing its place in UFO lore. Steven Spielberg's 1979 comedy film 1941 was loosely based on the incident, though it took considerable liberties with the facts. The 2011 film Battle Los Angeles used the incident as inspiration for a science fiction action movie about an alien invasion. The film's promotional materials even included doctored newspaper headlines and the famous retouched photograph, presenting them as authentic historical material, much to the frustration of historians who knew better. So where does this leave us? The UFO interpretation of the Battle of Los Angeles relies heavily on a retouched photograph that doesn't show what it appears to show, eyewitness testimony that is contradictory and unreliable, and the absence of a completely satisfying conventional explanation. It's an argument from ignorance,
We don't know exactly what was in the sky that night, therefore it must have been something extraordinary. But absence of certainty is not evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. The weight of evidence points toward a combination of weather balloons, radar anomalies, and mass misidentification, amplified by wartime stress and fear. That explanation may be prosaic and even a bit disappointing for those
who want the Battle of Los Angeles to be something more mysterious and exciting. But it has the virtue of being consistent with the known facts and requiring no extraordinary assumptions. The Battle of Los Angeles had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate damage and casualties of that February night. In many ways, the incident served as a kind of catalyst, accelerating processes that were already underway and providing justification for policies that might otherwise have faced greater resistance. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Los Angeles helped solidify public support for the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. Executive Order 966 had been signed on February 19th, 6 days before the battle, but implementation of that order was still in its early stages. There were questions about whether such drastic action was really necessary, whether it was legal, whether it was moral. The Battle of Los Angeles answered those questions for many people, or seemed to. Here was an apparent attack on Los Angeles. 20 Japanese Americans were arrested that night, 15 of them accused of fifth-column activities, allegedly signaling to enemy aircraft. Never mind that there almost certainly were no enemy aircraft. Never mind that the accusations were never substantiated. The arrests themselves seemed to confirm suspicions that Japanese Americans couldn't be trusted, that they were potential saboteurs and spies. In the weeks following the battle, implementation of Executive Order 966 accelerated. Japanese Americans were rounded up and transported to assembly centers, then to internment camps. The Battle of Los Angeles was frequently cited as evidence that such measures were necessary. If Japanese submarines could shell California, if Japanese aircraft could appear over Los Angeles, if Japanese Americans could signal to enemy forces, then clearly the entire community posed a security risk. This logic was fundamentally flawed, of course. The Ellwood bombardment did happen, but it was an isolated incident by a single submarine that caused minimal damage. The supposed aircraft over Los Angeles almost certainly didn't exist, and the allegations against Japanese Americans arrested that night were never proven. But in the climate of 1942, with fear and anger running high, flawed logic seemed perfectly sound to most Americans. The political impact of the battle extended beyond the Japanese-American community. The conflicting statements from Knox and Stimson, the inability of government officials to agree on basic facts, the evident confusion and possible incompetence of military forces all contributed to a crisis of confidence in the government's ability to protect the West Coast. Some called for the removal of war industries from coastal California to more secure inland locations. Others demanded congressional investigations into military preparedness. Still others questioned whether the command structure in California was adequate for the challenges it faced. The Battle of Los Angeles, intended to demonstrate military readiness, had instead revealed significant vulnerabilities in coastal defense. Over time, as the United States gained the upper hand in the Pacific War and the threat of Japanese attacks on the mainland receded, the Battle of Los Angeles faded from public consciousness. It became a historical footnote, a peculiar incident from the early days of American involvement in World War II, occasionally mentioned in histories but rarely examined in depth. Then came the UFO era of the late 1940s and beyond, and the battle experienced a kind of resurrection. Now it was no longer just a wartime incident. It was potentially the first modern UFO case, predating Kenneth Arnold's sighting by 5 years. Books and documentaries about UFOs invariably mentioned the Battle of Los Angeles. The retouched photograph appeared again and again, usually without acknowledgement of its doctored nature. This reframing of the battle as a UFO incident has both preserved public interest in it and distorted understanding of what actually happened. Many people today know about the Battle of Los Angeles primarily through its association with UFO lore. They've seen the famous photograph, heard about the mysterious object in the sky, learned about the massive military response. But they may know little about the actual historical context, the genuine fear that gripped Los Angeles in early 1942, the impact on Japanese American communities, or the complex interplay of human perception, technology, and psychology that likely explains the incident. The Fort MacArthur Museum, located at the entrance to Los Angeles Harbor, now hosts an annual event every February commemorating the Battle of Los Angeles. These events blend historical education with entertainment, recognizing both the serious historical significance of the incident and its place in popular culture. The museum presents the various theories about what happened that night, allowing visitors to draw their own conclusions. In Goleta, near the site of the Ellwood bombardment, markers commemorate the attack by the Japanese submarine I-17. The Sandpiper Golf Course, which now occupies the site of the old oil field, has a monument describing what happened there on February 23, 1942. These commemorations serve as reminders that while the Battle of Los Angeles itself may have been a case of mistaken identity and mass confusion, the threat that spawned it was very real. The battle has also become a case study in how historical events can be misremembered, reinterpreted, and mythologized over time. What began as a straightforward, if embarrassing, military incident has accrued layers of meaning over the decades. It's simultaneously a story about wartime panic, a case study in mass psychology, a reminder of injustice against Japanese Americans, and a touchstone in UFO mythology. This multifaceted legacy raises interesting questions about how we remember and understand historical events. Do we focus on what most likely happened based on evidence and investigation? Or do we preserve the mystery, acknowledging that some questions remain unanswered? Do we emphasize the human cost, the 5 civilians who died, the Japanese Americans who were unjustly arrested and later incarcerated? Or do we treat it primarily as a curiosity, an amusing footnote about the time Los Angeles fired 1,400 shells at nothing? The answer, perhaps, is that we need to do all of these things. We should examine the evidence rigorously and draw reasonable conclusions about what most likely occurred. We should acknowledge the unanswered questions without filling those gaps with unfounded speculation. We should remember the human impact, the real suffering that resulted from fear and prejudice. And yes, we can also appreciate the peculiar nature of the incident, the sheer strangeness of thousands of people witnessing something that probably wasn't there. The Battle of Los Angeles matters not because it was a successful military action or a genuine alien visitation. It matters because it reveals something fundamental about human nature under stress. It shows how fear can distort perception, how uncertainty can breed conflict, how the need to find meaning and pattern in chaos can lead us to see things that aren't there. So what really happened in the skies over Los Angeles in the early morning hours of February 25th, 1942? After examining all the evidence, considering all the theories, reviewing all the investigations and analyses conducted over more than 8 decades, what can we say with confidence? We know that radar detected something approaching the coast from approximately 120 miles out. We know that this contact prompted military authorities to order a blackout and put anti-aircraft batteries on alert. We know that at 3:16 in the morning, gun crews opened fire on what they believed was an enemy aircraft or balloon. We know that this firing continued sporadically for nearly an hour, expending over 1,400 rounds of ammunition. We know that 5 civilians died as a result of the chaos, and that property was damaged across Los Angeles by falling shells and shrapnel. We know that no enemy aircraft was shot down, no bombs were dropped, and no physical evidence of any enemy attack was ever found.
Beyond these established facts, we enter the realm of interpretation. The most likely explanation, supported by official investigations in 1949 and 1983, is that one or more weather balloons triggered the initial alerts. Once the firing began, the combination of searchlights, smoke, shell bursts, and war nerves created a cascade of misidentifications. Observers convinced themselves they were seeing enemy aircraft when they were actually seeing the effects of their own anti-aircraft fire. This explanation accounts for most of the evidence. It explains why nothing was
shot down. It explains the variety of eyewitness reports. It explains how experienced military observers could be convinced they were seeing aircraft that weren't there. It requires no extraordinary assumptions, no conspiracies, no technological marvels that defy known physics. But this explanation, while plausible and probably correct, can't answer every question. It can't fully explain the radar contacts. It can't account for why some observers reported seeing a large solid object that moved in a controlled manner across the sky. It can't completely reconcile all the contradictory eyewitness testimony. And that's okay. Not every historical incident can be explained with absolute certainty. Sometimes we have to acknowledge that we don't and can't know exactly what happened. The passage of time has erased some evidence, scattered some witnesses, and left us with an incomplete picture. What we can say is that the Battle of Los Angeles represents a perfect storm of circumstances that combined to create chaos and confusion. A legitimate military threat in the form of Japanese submarine activity off the coast, a population primed for panic by the Pearl Harbor attack, and constant warnings of impending assault. Primitive radar technology that detected something but couldn't accurately identify it. Military personnel trained for combat but lacking experience, manning defenses in a tense environment. Weather balloons used for routine measurements, potentially illuminated and reflecting searchlights in ways that could be misinterpreted. And finally, the cascade effect of one battery opening fire, prompting others to follow, creating smoke and explosions that fed the cycle of misidentification and response. Add all these factors together and you get the Battle of Los Angeles. No extraterrestrial spacecraft required, no government conspiracy needed. Just frightened, vigilant people doing their best to protect their city in a time of genuine danger, and in the process, creating a spectacle that would puzzle and fascinate people for generations. The human element in all this deserves emphasis. The men manning those anti-aircraft guns weren't fools or cowards. They were young Americans, most of them barely out of their teens, thrust into a situation of enormous responsibility. They'd been told the enemy was coming. They'd been trained to shoot at enemy aircraft. When radar detected something and observers reported seeing something, they did what they'd been trained to do. They opened fire. The civilians who flooded into the streets despite the blackout orders weren't reckless. They were people gripped by the same fear and fascination that has drawn humans to witness extraordinary events throughout history. When you hear explosions and see searchlights sweeping the sky, when you believe your city might be under attack, the impulse to see what's happening can overwhelm the impulse to seek shelter. The officials who gave contradictory statements weren't necessarily lying or incompetent, though the contradictions certainly didn't help the situation. They were dealing with incomplete information, conflicting reports, and the difficult task of trying to reassure a frightened public while acknowledging that a genuine threat existed. Even the journalists who retouched that famous photograph weren't engaged in deception, at least not by the standards of their time. They were following standard practice to create an image that would reproduce well in newsprint. That the enhanced image would later be taken as authentic evidence by UFO researchers couldn't have been foreseen. The story of the Battle of Los Angeles is, at its core, a deeply human story. It's about fear and how it can distort perception. It's about the limitations of human senses and technology when confronted with unusual or ambiguous stimuli.
It's about how the need to explain the unexplainable can lead us to embrace theories that range from the plausible to the fantastic. It's about how a single incident can resonate differently across generations, becoming something different to each new audience that encounters it. For the people who lived through it, the Battle of Los Angeles was terrifying. For Japanese Americans, it became part of the justification for their incarceration. For military historians, it's a case study in the fog of war on the home front. For UFO researchers, it's a potential early encounter with extraterrestrial intelligence. For skeptics, it's an example of mass hysteria and the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. For popular culture, it's a story that blends history, mystery, and science fiction in ways that continue to captivate audiences. All of these perspectives have some validity. All of them capture some aspect of what the Battle of Los Angeles means and why it matters. The incident is large enough, strange enough, and ambiguous enough to accommodate multiple interpretations. What we shouldn't do is reduce it to any single narrative. It's not just a false alarm, though that's probably what it was. It's not just a UFO case, though some will continue to argue that it might be. It's not just an embarrassing military blunder, though it certainly revealed problems with coastal defense coordination and communication. It's not just a footnote to the Japanese-American internment, though it played a role in that tragedy. The Battle of Los Angeles is all of these things and more. It's a window into a specific moment in American history, when fear and uncertainty reigned, when technology was advancing faster than our ability to fully understand it, when prejudice and panic could override constitutional principles, and when ordinary people found themselves thrust into extraordinary circumstances with results both tragic and strange. 8 decades later, we're still talking about it, still debating it, still trying to understand exactly what happened in those chaotic hours. And perhaps that's as it should be.
Incidents that resist simple explanation, that force us to grapple with complexity and uncertainty, are often the ones that have the most to teach us. So the next time you look at that famous retouched photograph of searchlights converging on something in the night sky over Los Angeles, remember that you're not just looking at an image from World War II or a possible UFO sighting. You're looking at a moment when fear, technology, and human perception collided to create something that defies easy categorization. You're looking at history in all its messy, complicated, endlessly fascinating reality. And that, more than any definitive explanation of what was or wasn't in the sky that night, is what makes the Battle of Los Angeles a story worth remembering and retelling. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of the most bizarre and fascinating incidents of World War II. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of Los Angeles, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. It really helps us continue bringing you these in-depth historical explorations. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think really happened that night. Was it weather balloons and war nerves? Something more mysterious? I'd love to hear your thoughts.